Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Desire is one of the deepest expressions of the unconscious. And when it comes to women's psychology, much of that desire is hidden, not because women are intentionally deceptive, but because society, culture, shame, and even self-protection force them to mask what they truly crave. On the surface, women may talk about what they want: stability, kindness, safety, love, and yes, these things are true. But Jung would remind us what is spoken is often only the persona, the mask society allows us to wear. Beneath that mask lies the shadow. And in the shadow, we find the raw, unpolished, unfiltered truth. That is where real desire lives. But here's the paradox. Many of these craving signs are never admitted openly. Why? Because to admit them would risk judgment, vulnerability, or loss of control. Jung understood that the psyche guards its deepest truths fiercely. Women may conceal their cravings not even just from men, but from themselves. They bury them so deep that they can only be expressed indirectly through behaviors, choices, fantasies, or contradictions. And this is why men often feel confused. They hear one thing, but they see another. They are told women want safety and love, yet they are drawn to men who radiate danger and power. They are told women value kindness, yet attraction often flares strongest for men who command respect more than approval. They are told women desire comfort, yet restlessness grows in comfort, and they long for the unknown. Jung would say, the unconscious is always speaking, even when the mouth denies it. The mask versus the shadow. To understand what women secretly crave, you must first understand Jung's distinction between the persona and the shadow. The persona is the image we present to the world. It is shaped by culture, expectations, and what is acceptable. For women, this often means saying they value stability, safety, and moral love because that is what they are taught to value. The shadow is the part of the psyche that holds everything repressed: the raw impulses, the forbidden fantasies, the darker hungers. For women, this shadow often contains the cravings they do not admit. Attraction to strength, to mystery, to men who embody danger and dominance. Jung emphasized that these two sides are always at play. What is denied consciously emerges unconsciously. What is hidden leaks out through attraction, emotion, and instinct. This is why women may say, "I want a nice guy," yet secretly feel no fire for him. It is why they may claim to desire comfort, yet restlessly long for the unpredictable. It is not that they are lying. It is that their persona speaks one language, while their shadow speaks another. Cravings they don't admit. So what are some of these cravings Jung would point to? They are not the cliches of superficial lust, but deeper archetypal patterns rooted in the unconscious. Strength without explanation. Women rarely admit how deeply they are drawn to men who do not justify themselves. Men who act with conviction, not permission. Jung would call this the archetype of the king or the warrior. Figures of presence, not apology. The dance with danger. Though women will never openly say it, the unconscious often craves the thrill of uncertainty. A man who can destabilize the routine, introduce chaos, and awaken intensity carries the energy of the trickster archetype. It terrifies and attracts simultaneously. The mystery of silence. Women may claim to want communication, but what they secretly crave is not endless talking. It is presence. Silence, when rooted in confidence, is magnetic. Jung would say it radiates the archetype of the sage, the man who does not need to prove, the unyielding masculine. What women rarely admit is their deep hunger for polarity. To meet a man who is so fully in his masculine energy that it awakens their own feminine depths. Jung saw this as the anima-animus dance, the unconscious masculine and feminine completing one another. The shadowed self. Jung taught that women are also drawn to men who mirror their shadow. A man who carries traits they deny in themselves: aggression, dominance, danger, can unconsciously fascinate them because he embodies what they cannot admit. Why keep these cravings secret? Jung would say, the unconscious hides what the conscious mind cannot yet handle. Women may fear judgment. To admit craving strength sounds like rejecting kindness. To admit craving danger sounds like irresponsibility. To admit craving dominance sounds like weakness. So they bury it, deny it, and even convince themselves it does not exist. But attraction cannot be buried. It leaks through behaviors. Choosing the man who makes them feel unsettled rather than safe. Staying attached to men they claim are bad for them. Feeling restless in relationships that offer everything they should want. Jung would call this the shadow's revenge. What you do not face consciously, you live unconsciously. The man who sees beyond the mask. This is why men who understand Jung's psychology hold power. Most men chase the persona. They try to be the nice guy, the provider, the one who checks every box. But this only satisfies the surface. The shadow remains untouched, and the shadow always wins. The man who awakens unconscious cravings does not beg. He does not try to be what women say they want. He embodies the archetypes that women feel but never admit. He becomes strength without justification, presence without noise, danger without recklessness. He understands that attraction is not logical. It is archetypal. And this is the secret Jung left behind. When you understand the unconscious, you no longer play the game on the surface. You see what others cannot. You hear what is never said, and you touch the shadow women never confess. Jung believed the psyche is never simple. It is a house with many rooms, some well lit, others hidden in shadow, and nowhere is this duality more visible than in desire. What women say they want and what they are drawn to often look like opposites. Not because women are deceptive, but because desire lives in paradox. Jung warned that the conscious mind can never fully explain attraction because attraction belongs to the unconscious. When women try to describe what they want, they speak from the persona, the polite, logical mask shaped by culture. But when they feel what they want, they feel from the shadow, the raw instinctual drive that breaks social rules. And here lies the contradiction. They will say one thing, but crave another. Safety versus danger. The first contradiction is between safety and danger. On the surface, women talk about wanting a man who is stable, protective, dependable. This makes sense. Safety is security, survival, and trust. But buried deeper, many women crave the thrill of danger. Not recklessness that destroys, but danger that excites. This is why the man who is too predictable slowly loses her interest. Safety without edge becomes boredom. The unconscious pulls her toward the man who unsettles her just enough to make her feel alive. This is not about chaos. It is about polarity. Jung would call it the archetype of the trickster who disrupts order to awaken transformation. It's why she may love the provider, but desire the rebel. Why she may cling to the man who offers peace, but secretly ache for the one who shakes her. Desire thrives in tension, not in calm. Kindness versus strength. Another contradiction. Women value kindness, but they are drawn to strength. They will say they want the sweet, gentle man who gives them everything. And they do, but only up to a point. If kindness is not rooted in strength, it becomes weakness. And weakness kills desire. Jung emphasized that the masculine archetype is not meant to dissolve into pleasing. It is meant to embody presence, conviction, and direction. Women may never admit that what they crave is not endless kindness, but kindness that comes from a man who could be dangerous, but chooses not to be. This is the paradox. Women are not drawn to cruelty, but they are not moved by weakness either. They crave polarity. The man who is capable of force yet restrained by choice. Jung would call this the integration of shadow. The man who has faced his darker impulses and mastered them. He is not harmless, but he is in control, and that is irresistible. Stability versus mystery. On the conscious level, stability sounds ideal. A steady man, a consistent life, a plan that never fails. But the unconscious craves mystery. A life too stable suffocates desire. Women rarely admit this because to do so would sound ungrateful or irresponsible. But deep inside, they hunger for the unknown. This is why women often test men. They create small storms, not because they enjoy chaos, but because they long to see if he can remain unshaken. They want to feel the mystery. Does he bend or does he stand? Is there more to him than what is visible? Jung saw this as the anima-animus dance, the inner feminine craving the depth of the masculine. Stability alone provides safety, but mystery awakens awe. Without mystery, desire dies. Comfort versus tension. Another contradiction lies in comfort and tension. Women will say they want comfort, a man who makes them feel relaxed, accepted, free to be themselves. And this is true. But if comfort becomes too familiar, it breeds complacency. The unconscious craves tension, the sense that she must still earn, still attract, still feel alive in his presence. This is why relationships often collapse when men think they've done enough. Desire does not thrive on comfort alone. It thrives on the subtle tension of polarity. She must feel him as solid, not just soft. She must feel that his presence demands something from her. Jung would say this is the archetype of the king, the figure who brings order, but never lowers his crown to be liked. Love versus power. Perhaps the most difficult contradiction. Women talk about wanting love, but unconsciously crave power. Not power to dominate them, but power that cannot be shaken. They may love the man who showers them with affection, but they desire the man who does not lose himself in that affection. Jung pointed to this paradox repeatedly. The anima, the inner feminine, longs for connection, but it also longs to merge with strength. Women may never admit it openly, but they crave a man whose love is rooted in sovereignty. A man who can say, "I love you," while standing in his own authority, not bending to her approval. This is why many women lose attraction when a man becomes too dependent, too needy, too controlled by love. Love without power feels weak. Power without love feels cruel. But the union of the two, love expressed from strength, is what women truly crave but rarely confess. Why contradictions are never admitted? Jung would say the reason these contradictions remain unspoken is because the conscious mind seeks consistency. To admit that you crave both safety and danger, kindness and strength, stability and mystery, comfort and tension, love and power, sounds like madness. It sounds like wanting the impossible. So women mask it. They speak only of what is safe, acceptable, and rational. They say they want stability, kindness, and comfort because that is the persona. But their behaviors, choices, and desires often reveal the shadow. The shadow always tells the truth. And this is why men who only listen to words miss the deeper reality. They try to be the perfect man by checking all the conscious boxes, but they ignore the unconscious contradictions, and so they fail to awaken attraction. The man who holds both, the rare man who understands Jung's psychology, does not choose one side of the contradiction. He embodies both. He is stable, yet mysterious, kind yet strong, safe yet dangerous, loving yet powerful. This man does not exist in theory. He exists in practice because he has integrated his shadow. He does not deny his darker impulses. He has faced them, mastered them, and now channels them consciously. Women sense this, even if they cannot articulate it. They crave it, even if they deny it. And when they meet it, they surrender. Carl Jung often warned, "People don't have ideas. Ideas have people." In the same way, people don't always choose desires. Desires choose them. And when it comes to women's hidden cravings, what they say and what they show are often two different stories. If you are only listening to words, you will be lost. If you want to see truth, you must learn to read the unspoken, because women rarely admit these cravings directly, but they always reveal them indirectly. The unconscious always leaks out in body language, in choices, in subtle contradictions. How women reveal their hidden cravings through attraction, not words. A woman may say she wants a gentle, predictable man, yet you will see her eyes light up around the one who carries quiet authority. Attraction speaks louder than declarations. Jung would say, this is the unconscious breaking through the mask of the persona through testing. Many men misunderstand women's tests. They think she is trying to annoy or control them. In truth, she is often unconsciously checking. Are you solid or do you bend? These tests are her way of seeking strength, mystery, and polarity without ever asking out loud. Through restlessness, instability, if she seems restless in a perfect relationship, it is not always because something is wrong. It is because something is missing. Jung would say she is unconsciously craving the archetypal polarity of danger, mystery, or tension. Comfort without fire leaves the soul hungry through contradictory choices. Watch not what she says, but whom she chooses. If her pattern is chasing men she claims are bad for her, it is not stupidity. It is shadow hunger. Jung would call this projection. She seeks in men what she denies in herself. Jung would warn, however, this power is dangerous if misused. To awaken women's hidden cravings without integrity is to play with fire. You may gain desire, but lose your soul. The true path is not domination. It is individuation, becoming whole so that attraction is not a trick, but a natural result of who you are. He would say, do not chase what women want. Chase wholeness, for when you are whole, the world, including women, will be drawn to you without effort. Do you think women know their own deepest desires, or are they hidden even from themselves? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if this video opened your eyes, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it. It helps us spread Jung's wisdom further. And if you want to support even more, consider leaving a super thanks. Carl Jung's psychology shows us desire is never random. It is archetypal, unconscious, and often unspoken. Women may never admit what they crave, but once you see through the mask, you cannot unsee it.